I've been given the cue that the consultants are ready, and we wanted to allow a few extra minutes for those who were on their way. I'm very delighted to see each of you this afternoon to hear the presentation that has been prepared for Thomas Nelson Community College by Hermitage Consulting Associates Limited, a firm out of Virginia Beach, Virginia. Kate McGoy is the president of Hermitage Consulting Associates Limited, and she served as the principal consultant for the Thomas Nelson Community College Enrollment Management Review process. This is Dr. Marty Sharp. She was a project member for the review, and she works at Old Dominion University, and she, of course, you see most of our students.
I'm off the clock right now.
Off the clock, no double dipping. We made sure of that. She would not do that in the process of conducting this engagement. Before they begin their presentation, I would like to introduce them a bit further by reading snippets from their biographical profiles. Ms. Kathleen or Kate McGoy, again, is president of Hermitage Consulting Associates Limited, and her work in the field of consulting has included engagements with major research institutions, small private colleges, and related not-for-profit entities. Her specialization relates to assisting institutions in the efficient and effective application of resources, including strategic planning processes and financial budget planning. Ms. McGoy brings more than 15 years of experience in higher education administration, including budgeting, financial analysis, revenue projections, facilities planning, human resource planning, enrollment projections, and graduation studies. In addition, her background and experience in internal auditing and financial forecasting, both in banking and in a corporate environment, provide essential skills to evaluate and examine the efficient and effective allocation of resources. Ms. McGoy most recently served as Vice President of Eva Klein and Associates Limited, a specialized consulting practice located in metropolitan Washington, D.C. Furthermore, Ms. McGoy served for 6 years as the Associate Provost for Finance at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As a member of the Provost's senior administrative staff, she served as the main channel of financial and administrative contact between the Provost and the College of Arts and Sciences, the 10 professional schools, and over 60 centers and institutes. Other key academic positions Ms. McGoy has held include serving as budget director at National Louis University, a small private university in Evanston, Illinois, as research associate in the Office of Institutional Planning and Research at DePaul University, Chicago, Illinois, and as financial planning analyst at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. Ms. McGoy is currently an adjunct instructor at Johnson & Wales University, where she teaches advanced accounting and introductory finance. Now, on to Dr. Marty Sharp currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Institutional Research and Assessment at Old Dominion University. In this position, she is the senior officer overseeing the assessment and evaluation of academic and non-academic areas of the university. In addition, as Senior Institutional Research Officer, she oversees management analysis and decision support for senior university officers, orchestrates compliance with state and federal data reporting mandates, and provides assistance and staff support for regional and specialized accreditation activities. Her responsibilities also include analysis of the university's position relative to accountability measures established by the state agencies, monitoring university performance on the Commonwealth Department of Planning and Budget Performance Measures, and the State Council of Higher Education's reports on institutional effectiveness and performance institutional effectiveness, I lost my place there, and performance indicators projects. Further, she analyzes university, Commonwealth, and national data and consults with state agencies on data sources and methods of data analysis. Dr. Sharp is also an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Counseling at Old Dominion University, where she teaches graduate courses in college and university organization and governance and institutional assessment. In addition, She sits on thesis and dissertation committees and assists in the administration and evaluation of the Master's Comprehensive Examinations. Dr. Sharp has served as a developmental counselor and evaluation specialist in the Center for Student Academic Development at the University of Delaware and as a field researcher for the System Development Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Believe me, their credentials surpass what I've read. I picked and chose snippets from their biographical profiles. But without further ado, I turn it over now to Kate LeBoy and Dr. Martha Sharp for their analysis, recommendations, observations,
all the good
else,
stuff.
all
that good stuff.
to enhance and improve the enrollment management process here at Thomas Nelson Community College. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that didn't put you to sleep, I don't know what you Whoa. A little bit more just on permanent consulting. We're a small specialized practice. There are only 2 principals in my group, and we work through a series of about 60 associates. We all hold positions in institutions of higher education throughout the United States and abroad. We use only individuals who are currently holding positions in higher education because we think that a strength of our practice is the fact that we draw upon people who are actually walking the walk and talking the talk rather than drawing on consultants who have kind of been out of practice for a while. So what we bring is not just the expertise that you see up here, but we really refer to a lot of our colleagues throughout every study that we perform. We make phone calls, we get good ideas, we get ideas from them, and we bring that back into the studies that we perform. Our practice really engages in about every kind of study involved in higher education. We've done space planning, space utilization studies at the University of Alabama. We've been engaged in an organizational study at William & Mary. We're currently involved in an information technology laptop initiative at the College of William & Mary. And we've done things like recruiting studies and faculty recruitment for the American University in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. So we really kind of engage in a lot of different types of work, drawing on the skills of associates all around the country and really all around the world. And we hope that that's brought a lot to bear on the study that we've performed for you. In terms of what it is that this particular study started back in April. We had to have the study completed by June 20th, it's 3 days away. So that's why we're coming to you today to give you our final presentation of the outcomes and the information that we gather throughout this study. There are 4 sections in our study. The first is just to give you an idea of what we did, the study process, just a background on how we performed our analysis, how we collected our data, how we gathered the information about Thomas Nelson. The second is to provide you with observations from them, things that we saw, some of the data that we collected that gave us good information about you. So the second part of this presentation is involved in just presenting our observations. The third is to present you with our recommendations. Based on that information, based on the context that we've made, peer analysis, literature review, etc., we've made a list, a fairly lengthy list of recommendations for Thomas Nelson. And then we'd like to conclude with what we think are important next steps for you, how to get started, kind of kick off the process and move forward. In terms of an overview, there is a particular comment in Thomas Nelson's existing strategic plan that states that the desire to coordinate, plan, examine, and create systems and services to support student recruitment and retention. That's goal 2 in your strategic plan under student recruitment and retention. And so a lot of that was the basis for really conducting this enrollment services review. And what we primarily did in this study was to determine how well the institution is positioned to recruit, manage, and project enrollments, and to serve as a mechanism to evaluate and recommend how these efforts could be enhanced and better support student outcomes. So that was really the focus behind this study. We think it's important to step back a little bit and after conducting a study like this to evaluate where you are at a point in time in terms of historical context. And we think that's really important, particularly here at Thomas Nelson, based on all of the changes that have occurred at this institution over the last several years. Beginning in the late 90s, you experienced rather significant budget cuts into even the early 2000s. Just recently, in 2003, you lost a president. You had a change in the head of enrollment services, a change in admissions. You take all of those budget and personnel changes and you compound that with the fact that you also underwent an enormous implementation of a software system, essentially forced on campuses by VCCS. Once you kind of step back and you look at all of those changes that took place, we really sensed an incredible degree of anxiety among staff, a little bit of chaos that kind of permeated our discussions. And you step back and you think about all that's happened over the last several years, and that's perfectly normal for where you are at this point in time. But we think it's important for you to step back and realize that because we also think you're at an incredible turning point in terms of where you're headed with Thomas Nelson. You have a new head of enrollment services, a new head of admissions. PeopleSoft is underway. People are really grasping that program, starting to manage it, understand what its functionality is. And here in July, you're going to begin the administration with a new president. You step back and you look at also the fact that in terms of the state budget, that there's an opportunity really for VCCS to receive funding this year and a very good opportunity for the possibility of Thomas Nelson to possibly receive some resources. So you're really primed at an incredible position when you look at just structure. You step back and also look at the fact that your markets, in terms of demographics of this area, are really extraordinary. The outbound student population, those who are interested in college, has really skyrocketed and it's projected to increase for the next several years. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We really think that there is an important moment to step back, realize where you've been, and then to turn that corner and really start to grasp the opportunities that lie ahead for you. In terms of the study process, our first step really in doing this was to visit each office kind of anonymously. We stopped by just to get a general sense of the atmosphere in offices, to see responsiveness of staff, to gather materials from staff and all of those kinds of things. It really gives us a good sense then of, how people respond to just strangers walking in. And we think that's important for us to do just as a general sense. So we did that. We also gathered an enormous amount of materials, catalogs, schedule books, organization charts, etc., about your campus to really prime us and establish a good foundation of information about who Thomas Nelson is. We take that information and we develop an individual interview protocol for each one of the groups that we meet with, and then we conduct interviews, individual interviews with about 16 administrators on campus, and then focus group sessions. We had about 60 participants in focus groups on campus that ranged from office staff to faculty to students, etc. And then we toured, and each one of the offices was gracious enough to take us on a tour of their space, tell us where different functions occur. In addition to that, we wandered your campus. We tried to determine how much time there was between various buildings for a student to just get around campus. We also toured the Williamsburg campus, a really beautiful place with lots of exciting things going on there. We looked at marketing materials in terms of what each of the offices has to offer, as well as information for external audiences. We also evaluated, to a certain degree, your information systems, website, and online, and kind of did a cursory overview of PeopleSoft. But most of our information in terms of that really came from interviews. It was really difficult for us to really kind of dive in and learn a lot about the details of PeopleSoft, so we relied heavily on interviews for that. We conducted a fairly extensive literature review, and then we made contacts and conducted a peer review to get good ideas and recommendations from different institutions all around the country.
Thank you. It's great to see so many of you here that really participated in this study. Most of the folks in the room at one point or another had some contact with us, and I can't tell you how much we appreciated your input and your willingness to really open up and tell us the things that we were trying to learn about it. And it really made it possible for us over this very short period of time to really learn to get to know you very quickly. Okay, let's talk about some of the observations that we made. Let's start first with, whoops, wrong button. And I'm the one with the technology skills. It's scary. I mean, in front of a group and all of that. Okay, let's talk about on your enrollment, many of these things you all will know, but I'm just from a 30,000 feet, these are the observations that I made.
Other way.
Thank you. Okay, over the course of a year's time, you all served 12,000 different students. This translates into a fall head count of around 8,000 students. There's been a rapid increase in head count enrollment over the last few years, but what this is a recovery from where you all were in the mid-90s. So you all saw a fairly precipitous drop in enrollment in the mid to late 90s, which has been basically recovered in terms of numbers. But the folks who left are different than the folks who came back. There's a definite shift toward full-time attendance over part-time. It's, again, not even 50-50 yet, but you do have more full-time students. The students that are coming now are younger. This is consistent with the demographics that will continue for 5 to 6 more years for this area and most of Virginia. There's an increase in minority students. Your minority enrollment is about 45% now. Your day enrollment has increased. Of your overall student head count, 43% of your students are pursuing transfer degrees. That's a slight increase over several years ago. 2/3 of your new students are attending college for the first time. Now that's an interesting point because of, what about the other third? The other third have attended college somewhere else before. Now when you're thinking about reviewing enrollment services and looking at services that you need to deliver students who are first-time students are probably going to need a little more support. For instance, than students who have been at another college. They kind of have a sense, well, you have to get admitted, then you have to get registered. The new student may or may not really understand the flow of enrollment services. And really, this 2/3, 1/3 split is very interesting. And it would be interesting to just kind of track and see the differential success rates of transfers and what we call at Old Dominion native students. And look at some of the reasons why students transfer. But most students, about 50% of the students that receive a degree nationwide have been at more than one campus. Multiple transfer is actually a pretty common phenomenon. Okay, let's talk about market niches. And this has to do with the distinct markets that we were able to discern that actually come to Thomas Nelson. Everybody's not the same. People come for different reasons. They come, they're different ages, different motivations. But we were able to, just from looking from the outside and talking to you all, to kind of divide groups up into different niches. Why is this important? This is important because, one, how you market to certain groups depends on who they are. What might be attractive to a recent high school graduate might not be attractive at all to an adult student that is just trying to receive a particular credential to advance their career. So you really need to divide your niches up for marketing purposes. The second area that's very, very important, and I've already alluded to it, has to do with dividing your niches up in terms of knowing what kind of enrollment services that each market needs. Again, the contract students get a different kind of service than the first-time freshman students who come in, and they need a different service. So the niches that we identified were the current high school students. These are the dual enrollment students that have grown tremendously over the past few years. This is a wonderful market. My nephew is from Richmond, and he went to J. Sarge and got all of his composition course, both his composition courses, done before he went to college. And so he really came in as almost halfway to his sophomore year, which really gave him an advantage to start, going into some of his major courses. This is a tremendous market that I really don't think can be underrated in terms of a potential market for you all, because many of those folks will become, we hope, all of those folks will become recent high school graduates and really enter into the market that you might want to recruit for Thomas Nelson. Transfers from other colleges. Kate and I get into this debate about whether you should recruit transfers from other colleges. I can see you, coming and setting your booth up, maybe up at Christopher Newport or William and Mary or somewhere. That wouldn't be very popular, but whether colleges, like it or not, there are a lot of transfer outs. Old Dominion has about a 78% retention rate. That means about 18 or 22%, thank you. 22% of our students leave after the first year. And we've actually tracked them with the help of the state council. We've actually tracked those students, and many of them transfer, do what is called reverse transfer. They go back, quote, back to the community colleges. That's not something you probably see on a billboard down in Norfolk, but that's just a fact. And so very often, for whatever reason, incidental or not, you're getting transfers from four-year colleges and perhaps even other two-year colleges. Contract enrollment for credit, there are a number of contracts you all have with businesses, industry, education, military, that are really involved in delivering a specialized course in a specialized setting, paid for by the employer. It's a very different kind of enrollment service that you need to deliver to these folks. Then you have a lot of non-credit enrollment. And we investigated this list because the larger focus is on credit enrollment. But a lot of your non-credit enrollees are potential credit enrollees down the road. The best single predictor of past behavior future behavior is past behavior. And if people are participants in the educational process, it's likely that they may participate more at a later date. And then the other category, which is any other groups that we really haven't identified. I bet you guys could come up with more different groups. But again, you've got to think in terms of marketing. You've got to think in terms of differential enrollment services for each one of these niches. Full-time staffing. Over the past 20 years, there's been a dramatic decrease in the number of full-time faculty here at Thomas Nelson. 20 years ago, you had 125. 10 years ago, you had about 100. And as of the last count I was able to get my hands on, you have about 87 now. So this is a dramatic decrease in full-time faculty. At the same time, over 20 years, you've increased tremendously in terms of your total headcount enrollment. So there's sort of these two forces going against each other. In 97-98, 52% of the credits taught were by full-time faculty. Within 5 years, that had dropped to 42%. And I don't have a more recent figure. This is from the fact book in institutional research. Okay. Administrative numbers are relatively stable. They're always saying at Old Dominion, all we do is get more administrators, and their administrator numbers actually have gone down some. But actually here, they're relatively stable. And the number of full-time classified positions actually has gone up, but we suspect, and we've had it pretty much confirmed, that that's associated specifically with appropriations with the Historic Triangle and with workforce development. We don't, from our discussions with folks on campus, we don't, on the main campus, in the offices that we talked to, we didn't get the impression that these positions were increasing.
Communication. In terms of our observations about communication, a lot of this came really from interviews. When I talked about interviews, all of our interviews were held confidentially with everyone. So there isn't any individual that's attributed for any individual comment or anything. But what we did is we drew those interviews together and we looked for consistent patterns of issues or concerns or suggestions, and we kind of pulled those out. We encouraged people to vent. And in terms of that, we think it's important for individuals to do that because it kind of gives us a sense of the atmosphere that people are working in. But we kind of placed that in another pot over here, and we understand that that was venting. So we really look for consistency in terms of the issues, in terms of the concerns, in terms of the suggestions. And a lot came out in terms of communication on campus. There are some serious issues that we felt in terms of the communication structure at Thomas Nelson. In the first place, there was stress by almost every office that other offices don't know how busy I am. Other offices don't know how much work I have to do. And so there's a huge issue about this whole concept of cross-functional workflow. It's important not just for other offices to know what you're doing, but for you to know what they're doing. Because every office is really tremendously overworked and very busy. And so we think it's important that something addresses this cross-functional workflow. There's an issue of underground communication. When sanctioned models don't work, when I call another office and nobody answers the phone and I have a student standing at my desk and I need to have an answer in order to serve that student, I can't call another office because nobody's going to pick up the phone. And so what I end up doing is calling my friend Mary in the other office because I know Mary will answer that question for me. Now, Mary probably isn't responsible for answering that question, but she's my friend, and I know she'll get that answer for me. And what happens when Mary's phone is busy? The customer goes unserved because there isn't anybody else. The sanctioned methods of reaching another individual are not in existence. And so there becomes this underground communication structure, which is really a very poor model to work with. Senior management, we heard second-guessing the decisions of staff. And what we sensed from our discussions that happens is that staff get together and get good ideas together, and they present them, and they're sent up through this chain of command, and they get to senior management, and senior management changes the decision. And rather than having senior management explain why the decision changed, because their decision, in fact, could be a good one, there was a lack of communication back down on why that change occurred. And so staff that are left feeling as though senior management is second-guessing what their good ideas are, and they're twisting the answer around, and they don't understand how it is that we should be operating. And so what that leads to is a definite undermining and a lack of staff appreciation. Staff do not feel heard, they don't feel listened to, they don't feel any kind of sense of appreciation for their good ideas. And so there needs to be built some communication flow where good ideas flow up. If a change occurs, the reason for that change needs to be pushed back down so that staff have a clear understanding of a change in direction. So we talk about poor communication in terms of horizontally. Staff don't know what's happening across the spectrum from one office to another, and a very definite poor communication structure up and down throughout the organization. And what arises from that, and we heard this repeatedly as a term used, is secret knowledge. One manager may communicate back with their staff why some change occurred, and another manager does not. So what ends up happening is this group of staff over here has knowledge, and this group of staff over here has none. Well, why were they informed and I wasn't informed? Was I not supposed to be told? Is this something that I'm supposed to be left out of the loop on? So there becomes this sense of secret knowledge. Somebody has knowledge and I don't. And that's a very poor way to manage. Observations about operations. We looked at a lot of business policies, and there are a lot of practices on campus. But there's definitely a confusion between a consistent, coordinated mechanism for established business policies. There isn't one place that staff can go to have an understanding of what a policy is. There's information that's communicated in the catalog, there are different things on the website. Some individual offices have written things down and tried to communicate it with their staff, but there doesn't seem to be a clear business policy or repository for information of business policies across the campus. And that leads a lot of staff to kind of guess what the practice is, or to misinterpret something as a rule, or misinterpret some practice as a policy, and that can be really problematic in trying to make decisions. We think there's a problem in the fact that there is a lack of a budget process. This could be my budgeting background coming through here, but we think budget processes are important because they allow two things. One, they allow individual offices to organize a requirement for resources and have an understanding of what the resources are that are given to them. And then when we talk about resources, we talk about not just financial, but human resources and facilities as well. So you have a very clear understanding of the resources that are provided to you in order to operate your particular area or function. And then there's an important aspect in that from senior management's perspective in evaluating how you utilize those resources from year to year. How much did you accomplish given the staff that you have, given the office that you have? And it gives an opportunity for managers to come forward and say, if I had an additional staff member, this is what I could accomplish. I could do this more in terms of customer service, or serve these more students faster or better or whatever. And so there's an opportunity for revisiting those resources on an annual basis. So we think that coordinated form of a process is important. The telephone system. This was repeatedly talked about in every meeting that we had about how staff are just bombarded with calls that are completely outside of their particular area of responsibility. People calling and wanting to know hours of operation. Could I get directions to Thomas Nelson? And so staff in individual offices are answering general questions and being taken away from serving customers individually by these kinds of telephone calls. We understand that the system does allow for a menu type of an arrangement where you call the Marine Science Museum and they say, welcome to Marine Science Museum, our hours of operation are da da da, and directions, press 1. And then they go on to say, if you want to reach so-and-so, press this, if you want to reach so-and-so, press that. At any time, dial 0 for our assistance. We think that would be an important thing to do. And even maybe to drill that down into individual offices like admissions, etc. What ends up happening, our sense is that the phone's ringing all the time, a lot of communications go to voicemail, and then it's up to the staff to go back, retrieve all those voicemails, and sort through, well, do I need to call them back now because they called 2 hours ago and all they wanted was directions? We have directions. So you're sorting through these voicemail messages, trying to decide what you're going to do with them. That's problematic. Rules versus policies versus practice. We think it's important to make a very clear distinction about what a rule is. A rule is something, in our sense, that comes down from the Virginia Community College system or as a state rule or something like that you don't really have the ability to change within your own purview. A policy is something that's implementation of a rule here at Thomas Nelson. Here's how we do it. This is our policy. This is how we adapt or adopt whatever it is that particular rule is within our own campus. And then we have practices. This is different tasks and the way we get things done. We think it's important to separate those and understand what is truly a rule. Is it really a rule that particular students have to be handled this way or whatever? And it's often worth going back and revisiting, if there's a huge issue on your campus, revisiting with the Virginia Community College system that that rule is still in place. Could it be changed? Is it a different way of operating in doing business today? And reviewing and evaluating those rather than just accepting them as the way that things have to be done.
Your turn. To make a few observations about technology. Implementation of PeopleSoft. I don't know where you would have had to be over the last 2 years at Thomas Nelson to not have been affected by the implementation of PeopleSoft. This Old Dominion went through a similar implementation about 5 years ago, so we still have the occasional nightmare. A few flashbacks every once in a while. I've had a lot of flashbacks actually since I've been up here at Thomas Nelson. But PeopleSoft has been around now for a couple of years. It's largely implemented for basic functions that support enrollment services. Folks have made several kinds of observations about using PeopleSoft, and I'll tell you that it's not just PeopleSoft. It's any movement from a text system to a Windows-based system. Very often you have to go through more steps, more screens, more windows to do something that used to take only 1 or 2 steps. So it feels more labor-intensive. It feels a little less comfortable for those of you who were survivors of the legacy system. Folks tell us there are a lot of workarounds, that sometimes we can't quite get the system to do exactly what it did on the old system. So now we're having to do a workaround. Okay. One of the things that we'll talk a little bit about in our recommendations about looking at workarounds and maybe questioning whether or not really the system can do it or not. And you all have some opportunities coming up that are likely to resolve some of your workarounds. We heard a number of times we're just putting Band-Aids on stuff. We're just patching things. We wish we would just step back and fix the more systemic problem rather than continuing to patch things over to get the students started now. Okay. And then there was an issue with ongoing training and documentation. I was in a meeting where the process for doing something that is a very, very common process throughout campus came up as a subject of discussion. And one person said, well, the way I do it is this, and then I hit the printer thing, and then I do this, that, or the other. And then somebody else across the room said, but wait, I do it this way. And somebody else came up with a third way of doing it. This suggests that maybe there probably is the best of all choices available, but it isn't common knowledge. And this was a very core central task that many, many folks in enrollment services throughout campus would be expected to be able to do. Observations about personnel. Very heavy reliance on part-time and temporary or 90-day personnel. Okay, there's some very definite training and institutional knowledge issues, especially with temporary. You have a lot of long-time part-time employees, which is very, very fortunate for this institution. institution, that you've had a lot of part-time people that have been willing to hang in there and keep going. But with the temporary employees, you have to go through retraining because you cannot rehire them. You have to bring somebody else in. So there's a huge amount of effort and energy in just maintaining institutional knowledge over with individuals who may not have a long-term commitment to the institution. The need for increased hands-on supervision. A number of the operational areas said, I just really wish we had a little more hands-on supervision and have a way to just be sure that we're being consistent in how we're doing things on the front line. So a little more attention to direct supervision on the front line. Again, with the staffing situation the way it is, this is not a surprising observation because everybody's wearing one or two or three hats. And finally, there's no way not to conclude that there's not enough staff. I think that's the most pressing issue that we really came up with. It's very hard to do what you all are doing with the staffing situation you have. I'm really, frankly, amazed, and actually was quoted off campus at Old Dominion as saying I was never going to complain about staffing again. Of course, when I cross the water, I have to change my mind about that. But really, my hat's off to you guys. I don't know how you do it. I really don't know how you do it. It's just a really amazing effort and commitment that I see here. That's just really, it's heartwarming. So,
you can tell Marty's slides all have the little fly-in thing, and all the little colors and all that stuff. Mine are very basic.
you can tell which slides are mine.
Observations about functional areas. We think that the college really needs to move back to just standard terminology that's used in higher education, rather than terms like intake. I'm not sure what that sounds like, but it isn't working for me. We think that counseling needs to be viewed as it is viewed in the majority of institutions as a psychological type of counseling. That's what it is on most campuses. It's where students go for some form of evaluation and support. It's very different than the notion of advising, which is an academic trait used on campuses. We think those need to be separated. So we would like you to move back and evaluate your areas in terms of very traditional terminology that's used. We think it's important in terms of how you operate, but we also think that's extremely important viewing the student population that you're dealing with. These are students who are coming, in many cases, from other institutions of higher education, and they have no notion what an intake is. And when they're looking at counseling, they know they don't need psychological counseling, but they probably do after several days. Anyway, we think it's important to separate out and understand what the terminology is in terms of marketing versus advertising versus public relations. Marketing, in our mind, is really an overall institutional philosophy of how institutions want to operate. That's the notion like customer service. That's a marketing philosophy that institutions want to really build a process around. When we talk about advertising, those are paid things that are very targeted towards specific audiences. When we talk about public relations, that's something you don't pay for. That's just the goodwill of the community writing up about the fact that Tom Kellen is a great guy, and oh my gosh, by the way, he happens to work at Thomas Nelson Community College. And then you cut it out, you put it on the bulletin board, and you use it in all your communications and stuff. So that's free, but that's the goodwill in the community. And we think it's important to just understand those three things because we really do think you need a marketing plan. And that's really grasping and putting your arms around a philosophy for this campus on how you're going to communicate who Thomas Nelson is and what you're about. Advising is broken. What else can we say? I mean, we heard it really basically from every corner of the campus. It's everywhere and it's nowhere. Students had no sense of advising. Faculty really know that it's not being done. Many faculty voice that they really want to be engaged in that, but they're not sure how it's going on here. A lot of faculty have been at other campuses where it's handled very well, and there's just definitely something lacking. So we need that, and we think that needs to be coordinated. The degree progress reports, that's really only partially implemented and very problematic. Problematic for faculty, problematic for students, and clearly problematic for graduation. So that really needs to be fixed. We think something needs to be done, particularly if we have a focus on retention, about students in academic difficulty. Right now, they are not flagged. They're left hanging out there. There really needs to be a support network built around those students, something that really flags them, pulls them in, and requires them to get advising support. These are students that really, with enough intervention, can be successful on this campus. And if we really put our arms around retention, we really need to do something for those students, identify them, bring them back in, and help them to be successful. There continue to be these conflicts in day-to-day functions, back office, front office. What am I responsible for? I keep getting pulled out of what I'm doing and sent to do something else. So there's a lot of confusion in just day-to-day functions within various offices on campus. We think we need to step back and really have a very clear understanding of what positions are, position descriptions are, what employees are responsible for, and separate functions within office so that individuals can be successful in what it is that they're doing. Student privacy and staff security. This particularly came up in the admissions area. That the way in which that office is configured, you have a very busy office, a lot of commotion, it's very crowded, and you have staff and students interacting in a very tight environment. And in many cases, staff said that they are asking students very personal questions, and there's a lot of people around, and students don't want to articulate that. So they try to whisper, and they don't want to say out loud their social security number, their home telephone number, or the fact that they flunked out of another institution and that's why they're enrolled. And yet staff need to hear it because they got to fill out that application, so they ask them to repeat and repeat again. And so students become enraged. They're angry and they react. And so you're just building a very difficult environment for staff to be successful and for students to be successful. So we think something really definitely needs to occur and maybe some different form of design. There's student service organization. We talk to a lot of students about that, and they don't know where it is. They don't know what exists there. We think that something definitely needs to be derived so that there's a very clear channel of student services on this campus, and that students know where that service is and how to reach it. Career assessment, the students that we talk to were not aware of any career assessment that goes on at Thomas Nelson. And yet we have workforce development just right here with a very exciting program that's going on, and there is career planning here on campus, and yet students are unaware of that. So something needs to happen to really build that bridge and bring that information together so that students are aware of that service particularly. Placement testing, there was a big question from faculty on whether or not students are being placed appropriately, whether or not students are being placed too high and therefore are successful in those courses, or whether they're being placed too low and therefore being encouraged to take courses that they really don't need to take. So we think something needs to be done to evaluate that placement testing, really get a better sense about whether students are being placed appropriately. College obligation for student responsibility. This is a notion that as we talked and we listened in a lot of these interviews, it is not clear on this campus where the student's responsibilities kind of begins, where college obligation stops. If we want students to be independent thinkers, if we want students to be independent in their actions, move towards a self-service environment, encourage them to be mature about the way in which they act in a college, then we need to teach them and train them. And then at some point in time, then that student responsibility picks up and the college's obligation starts to shift away. We can't hold their hand and allow them a lot of different options because that's not teaching them good things, and that's kind of what they're all about. Historic Triangle Campus, we think they are an excellent model of one-stop shopping. But right now, there's a big question about whether or not they're going to get overloaded pretty quickly. We have a lot of Hampton campus students who are going out to the Triangle campus because the service is so personal and the response is so good that Hampton campus students are going up to Williamsburg to get service. There's a big question of how long that's going to last before the services at those campuses are really under so much pressure that given the growth that's going on up there, that they'll continue to be successful. Last time I talked through Marty's slides, she wasn't happy.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what we found when we went to the literature and we talked with our peers about the whole area of enrollment services and enrollment management. During the 1990s, for various reasons, there was a real change in philosophy on how enrollment services were delivered. Colleges change. Well, colleges are always changing, and there were many changes during the 1990s. Their constituents changed, became more diverse, needing to really serve more different kinds of students. Technology emerged. Really, a lot of the information systems that we are using now were really getting fully developed in the early to mid-90s. And basically, the conclusion was made by many schools that there was a need to fundamentally change how business was being done. Now, these changes involved people, how people did their jobs, what processes were important. Processes were re-engineered, really rethought through, redeveloped, and technology really came to bear in a way that it really never could have 20 years ago. So what came out of all of this was what is called a student-centered vision of enrollment services, really focusing on the needs of students, and really through that focusing on each groups of students that we've outlined for you, focusing on what the goals do we have for those students in terms of being able to serve themselves versus being able to provide support when they were unable to serve themselves. What actually came out of this was the willingness, desire, and motivation to redesign the services, to develop things like a one-stop service center, to implement cross-functional teams rather than working only in your very specialized area. I'm an expert in records. Really develop knowledge across areas and kind of have a sense of what happens in admissions, registration, kind of all the way through to kind of help people move from one place to the next. Establish self-service objectives in addition to thinking about how we're going to directly face-to-face serve students. Actually think of ways that we can help students learn the basic things they need to know on their own by making these things readily available and easy to use. Again, some student group populations will find that relatively easy and will take the initiative. Others will need more assistance. Develop web-enabled services. Gosh, I remember back, I guess it was in the late 80s when one of the associate vice presidents over educational technology at Old Dominion came to me and said, I want to show you this program. It's called Mosaic. And what it was the precursor to Netscape and to what we know as Internet Explorer. It was a browser and actually looking at graphical things rather than just text across the Internet. I'd been emailing on BitNet, but I'd never even had a concept of having pictures and files and things that are linked, and rather than going through just a linear process of finding things to go here or there, and to connect this whole web of things together. If you really think creatively about that and think about how students might want to navigate something like that, you can really think about how your services could be delivered to some great extent via the web. And then, final point I want to make here is the folks that went through these transformations, and we read a series of case studies on this, really went through what is called a systemic change. It's not making a little change over here, a little change over there, and a little change over there. It's really taking a look at the whole process, throwing it up in the air, and really having it come down to be something fundamentally different than what it started out being. So institutions that have successfully redesigned their processes recognize the need to reinvent the processes, throw out their old assumptions. We always did it this way and it seemed to work, so why should we change it? Well, that doesn't cut it in this kind of transformation. And redesign around student requirements, know who your customer is or who your customers are, and really focus designing your services to meet them where they are. And then finally, come up with a way to measure whether you got where you wanted to be. The old saw in planning is if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to know when you get there? You have to have a way to measure where you plan to go and to see if you've actually done that. An example would be in the records office. You get a request for a transcript and the clock starts running. How long did it take from the time of the request for the student to receive the transcript? And that could vary from day to day, but that's a measure you could actually implement and see how long and how efficient you are providing various kinds of commonly used services. Okay, so there's a movement from an old process process to a new process. And these triangles represent the amount of effort and time involved in a particular area. And the old process is a relatively small amount of self-service, sort of an intermediate amount of effort being provided by what are called generalists. Whoops.
Oops.
Didn't make you move it forward. Move those pointers. And then finally, a whole lot of effort being expended by a series of specialists. In the new process, you try to engender a great deal, especially over time, maybe not initially with new students, a great deal of self-service where a student, before they'll call or walk up to a customer service desk, will take a look and see if they can answer their own question. You know, when is the tuition deadline? What is the deadline for applying for a particular scholarship? Things like that. To try to engender a whole culture of helping students serve themselves. You can see a whole lot of effort and time and services being provided there. Then, underneath that, have a group of generalists who have the ability to respond to initial inquiries, to repetitive inquiries, and to provide guidance and navigation to students so the student will enter the enrollment services process at the right point based on where they are currently. So the generalist asks them a series of questions and says, okay, well, you know, where you need to start, you first need to turn in that domicile form in admissions, or give it to me and I will refer it to admissions. The decision is typically made within 2 days or whatever. And provide the students that orientation of where they fall on this enrollment services continuum. And then finally, specialists are there to deal with complex issues, highly unusual combinations of problems. You've all seen them. You know, you've never heard of a student who had this issue and that issue at the same time, and they need to be dealt with and solved together. And they really deal with the more exceptional cases. But there's a very large, basic amount of work that is pretty common across all students. And the generalists are able to kind of have a basic understanding across all areas to make sure the student enters the system at the right time, right place. How many times do we hear when we talk to folks about the student who got in the wrong line? And, you know, waited 20 people and then got up front and realized they were in the wrong place. Those are the kinds of things having a generalist to kind of diagnose where they are and send them to the right place would be very helpful. People who work best in these process-centered customer service areas like to work in teams. They reject the whole concept of a silo where this is my area and everything else is outside and no one know about it. You really have to be able to cross areas. You have to exercise judgment. You have to take initiative. You have to have good interpersonal skills. You have to be able to deal with somebody that's upset and sort of diffuse them a little bit and help them feel like somebody really is trying to help them. And you have to recognize both internal and external customers. You all are each other's customers. You know, normally we think of the customer as the guy from outside, but really, we are all each other's customers, and you have to be really conscious of that. And you have to be willing to understand the enrollment process from beginning to end, and really feel some responsibility for making the whole thing work. Is there something I could do here, earlier in the process, that could help somebody later in the process get through?
Again. Recommendations. This is the next part of the study. Our recommendations about what do you think? We heard in many offices that you currently operate using the DMV model. And while I was telling some of you earlier that I'm actually very pleased with the DMV model. I had twins who just went through and got their driver's license, and so it was an extremely tense period for a mother sitting there. But they handled me very well, and they were very kind. And so I'm very happy with DMV. I just don't think it necessarily works here. And we would like to recommend for you, rather than applying a DMV model here, that you consider a branch banking model. And if you think about branch banking, you think about the fact that now they have all these automated tellers, and there's so much you can do on your own, that you can go and you can, get money, you can make deposits, you can do all those kinds of things on your own at a self-service banking. If you walk into a branch, there's usually always, Bank of America, a generalist who meets you at the door, What can I help you with today? Oh, you need this form to fill out, and then when you fill it out, bring it back to me and I'll look at it. And they evaluate, oh yes, now you're ready, let me have you introduce you to the loan officer over here, and this is Mr. So-and-so, and then you meet right with the loan officer. Or you fill out this change of address form and now you need to get in line at the tellers, and they'll take care of you here. So when you're walking up, it's that generalist notion. There's someone there to assist that person on the outside with their very general questions, and then there are specialists in the background, the loan officer, etc., who helps you with a more detailed issue, kind of navigating you behind the scenes. We also think of the notion of an enrollment services center. This would be in the form of a model where we're talking about specialists and generalists, and we also think it's probably not a bad idea to consider it in the term of a physical location. For example, in the lobby of Griffin Hall, to put up a counter of some sort during those peak times where you've got generalists who are there to navigate students in the right place, help them fill out the right form, have them evaluate it, tell them what line they need to be in. And we also think it'd be an idea to do some form of a list of how to, and have these placed all over campus, how to register, how to fill out an admissions form, what's necessary for financial aid, all these kinds of how-tos where students, self-service, can walk in and say, oh, that's what I needed to know. I didn't know what a W-2 was and what my 1040 was. And it says right here, here's a little picture of a W-2, and here's a picture of a 1040. That's what I need for financial aid. So they're coming in and they're pulling these out, and that's a self-service. Then if they have a question, they go to that counter and they say, I don't understand what this is saying, and there's someone there to answer that question for them. So that by the time they get ready to actually get in that specialist line, they have direction. They know they're in the right line. They've been helped. We think those generalists don't need to be low-level staff. We think those generalists need to be a very high-level staff with good interpersonal skills who have a very clear understanding of navigating the entire process of enrollment services, doing outreach to students, understanding what all these different populations and markets are, and really coaching them through this process on a very individual basis. So we think cross-training of staff members is an extremely important thing that needs to go on here, so that there's a very clear understanding of how to navigate all these processes and to facilitate that for students. We think it's important to have an understanding also within office of a separation between what we consider to be front office activities and what we consider to be back office activities. Front office being those things where you are actually meeting with students. It's a one-on-one. That student needs your full attention. And then there may be an individual there who's answering the phones. And then there are people in the back office who are responsible for particular projects, data entry, filing, those things that we don't want them to be distracted from. If you're doing data entry, the last thing you want is your data entry person answering the phone. Did I enter that already or not? I don't remember. Well, I'll go on to the next thing. And then they've missed this whole series of data entry things. Or they're working on a project. You want them working on a project, you want the project done. That's kind of the reason you gave it to them in the first place. And interrupting them consistently doesn't mean you're going to get it done. So we think those back office functions need to be separated from the front office functions. We also think it's important to possibly consider bringing in some sort of a designer to help you with the admissions office, to really reconfigure that space that promotes security, promotes some form of privacy for students when they're coming up and they're meeting with staff. We think it's important to convert the frontline staff to full-time positions. Those individuals who are interacting with your customers need to be employees who are dedicated to that task. And that's not saying that your temporary individuals or your part-time staff are not, but we think that that needs to be a consistent, well-managed group of individuals who have a very clear understanding of day-to-day activities. Those individuals should be your frontline people, and that means full-time, dedicated staff who have an understanding that they'll be evaluated and reviewed based on customer service and how they're delivering that service to students. The Staff Enrollment Center, or the Enrollment Services Center, we think should be staffed with well-trained generalists, individuals who have a really good, clear understanding of that entire process and facilitate students through that process. And then those specialists would be within those individual offices, well-trained in particular special aspects of what goes on within that particular area. We recommend that you actually organize and configure a recruiting staff to coordinate the recruitment efforts and focus on those market niches that Marty was talking about earlier. Dual enrollments, high school students, transfer students, evaluating those credit students who are engaged for workforce development and those various kinds of contract courses. Looking at those non-credit students, and are there ways in which that we can bring them into the fold? So you need to have a very clear understanding of what each one of these market niches are and how to coordinate and go out and target those through a very targeted recruitment strategy, but have recruiters who are dedicated to doing that, staff that are dedicated to doing that. We also think it's important for those individuals to direct the marketing that's done with those staff so that they're developing or at least directing the development of those marketing materials. They're going to know what's important in terms of the kinds of communication as they go out and meet with these high school counselors and different high school students, what kind of materials are important for them to have. So they should be engaged in the development or oversight of the development of those particular kinds of activities. As I said earlier, it's just really important that you use higher education terminology, particularly recognizing who your markets are, the fact that you have students and a high number of students who are coming in from other institutions of higher education. We also think it's important to use traditional titles. Right now you have a Dean of Student Success. We would recommend that that be a Dean of Student Services. You need a director of admissions, you need a registrar, you need a cashier. These are common terms that are used in higher education, and those are things that students will look for as they move through this process. We think those are important. As I said, you need to develop and work on a recruitment strategy and a recruitment plan. Which of these markets are going to be important for Thomas Nelson in the future, given the demographics of this area, and then you're going to have a very targeted recruitment strategy for going out and working with high schools, et cetera, and cultivating those populations, understanding their needs, and bringing them in through a very targeted and dedicated process to make those students successful on our campus. We talked about all these different niches, high school students, recent high school graduates, transfers, credit, et cetera. And each one of these is a very targeted strategy for going out and bringing them into Thomas Nelson, and then a dedicated plan of making them successful on this campus. We would recommend consolidating our advising and counseling areas, all under what is currently known as student success, but would be known as student services. All of those functions under one dean. We would also place placement testing under that, linking it with advising under that dean. We think all of those are directly related. There needs to be a very strong bridge built between that particular area and the academic deans. There needs to be a lot of faculty contact, and that needs to be a focal point for students. Advising is critical. Faculty interaction is the one thing that's been proven time and time again to allow students to be successful in higher education, is that kind of personal interaction with faculty members. That needs to occur on this campus if you're going to do anything about having a successful retention strategy.
Okay. Recommendations with regard to communication. Develop clear, regular, and open channels of communication, both across the areas that parallel in the enrollment services area, and also horizontally, vertically. Yeah, vertically. I knew I would mess that up. Vertically. Information needs to move up and down. And they need to feel like that they can express a viewpoint or make a suggestion. Customer service should be accepted as a responsibility of every employee at every level of the organization. So everyone is responsible for providing good customer service. An internal customer service, office to office, and really external customer service too, with your potential students and your students, should really be part of the performance review. In our standard performance reviews for administrators at Old Dominion, one of the items for all of us, the new counters in my office, is customer service. We focus a lot on serving other people within the university as well as people outside. So again, the report structure should support communication and support understanding functionality across areas. Training is essential to improve. The actual training process can be used to improve communications, and we have some ideas about that. And managers at all levels should be empowered to run their areas and be provided comprehensive information from their supervisors. So folks need to, when you learn something or know something that's going to come down the road later, kind of give people a heads up about it. The college website is another mechanism for improving communication, and Nelson Online, obviously. Nelson Online really provides the primary source for self-service options right now, registration and checking and loading grades, things like that. And it really provides an opportunity to disseminate more information by weaving your website in with Nelson Online. The website also as an intranet or an internet being really only available on campus and not really available to the world at large, is a repository for your policies and procedures and your how-tos. The how-tos that are on the wall or on the bulletin board near the Enrollment Services Center could actually be put on the web so people could access that from other locations. But also your policies and procedures and your catalogs should be on there. In terms of business practices, current policies, procedures, and business practices should be established where they're not. And we know that a lot of these exist, but really put it in a common format and made widely available. They need to be documented, and policies and procedures need to be consistently applied. There were cases where frontline staff told us that they were enforcing a policy that they understood was to be enforced, only to find midday that the policy for a temporary reason had been suspended and that they had sent many students away, and now had to tell students something different. That's hard on morale. That makes people feel bad because they worry. People really do care. People really do worry about those students that now they don't know how to get in touch with to update them on what the policy is. If these things are done, establishing, documenting, and really implementing consistently your policies and procedures, it's going to increase your efficiency, and people are going to understand what's going on. Students are going to learn to know that the tuition deadline is by 5 p.m. on this day. And they will, in a very short period of time, will adhere to the expectations. In terms of business practices, Kate has already talked about the need for a budget process that evaluates the current funding levels and allows the opportunity for different areas to say what they've done and what they would like to do in the next year, and to review the resources they have. This is a process that we've continued at Old Dominion, despite the budget cuts. But we were always asked to say, should things change, what differently would you like to do? And we were always also allowed to reconfigure what we were doing, even within our existing resources. But the exercise of going through your accomplishments, talking about what you want to do next year in the context of your financial, physical, and human resources is an extremely important exercise that you really need to go through. Recommendations in terms of technology. While PeopleSoft has largely been implemented, much more needs to be done to make it more efficient in the support of enrollment service. You need to evaluate your workarounds to determine if the system functionality has really been fully researched. Is it possible there may be a different way to implement things that you're now currently doing with workarounds? And is it possible to identify ad hoc queries that might supplant the limitations of the system? So you can run a query, jump away from the client and jump into Crystal reports or somewhere like that and run a query to get around the problem that you can't get exactly what you need from the system. And I think that's something that needs to be investigated. We really feel strongly that a functional PeopleSoft support system should be created for the enrollment services area. And this person would ensure that adequate training and support existed. They would oversee the development and dissemination of documentation. They would set priorities, help set priorities, which is the first thing we'll fix, and the second, which affects the most people, rather than the fairly unstructured method for this process right now. Make sure that all of the capabilities of PeopleSoft have been implemented, and very, very important is an opportunity that's coming up with a new release of PeopleSoft. within the next few months, there's going to be a new release of PeopleSoft, and at some point, you're going to have to implement it here at Thomas Nelson. Chances are some of the things that you don't like about the current version are addressed by the new version. And somebody, or somebodies, a group of people really, need to get ahead of that implementation. Don't wait until it's time to implement it. But to really get a sense of what's going to be new in the system. What new functionality do you need to prepare for? What problems that you wanted to go ahead and start fixing now, maybe you'll wait for the next version, because maybe it'll be fixed there and you can focus on something that may not be fixed. So really kind of take a more forward-looking view toward the implementation of PeopleSoft. In terms of technology, and this is really technology and it's advising and it's business practices, and it really kind of goes all kinds of places, but I put it in technology because there's a technology component to it. That's the single most important thing that I think could happen to help the most different areas. Get the rules underlying the degree progress reports that need to be set up in PeopleSoft. You need to get them set up. Because the degree progress reports are mixed. They're affecting graduation. They're affecting the review for graduation, which affects records. It affects the divisions. It's affecting the students because the students don't really know how to read this thing. And some of the information that they're getting is not accurate relative to the program that they're pursuing. And so we really strongly recommend that a really full-fledged effort go to dedicate someone to actually, with adequate support from the academic divisions, to actually get these degree progress reports and what needs to be done in PeopleSoft done to get them straightened out. Because having that degree audit capability will provide your students the ability to do a lot on their own and to do some self-advising. But unless those are accurate, the potential for error is great. Take the wrong course, or students could just get frustrated. And to do this is not a small task. We've been working on this, actually a degree audit system since around the time I came to Old Dominion in 1983. And we're still working on the one in Banner. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. But y'all have, yours is going better than ours is. I didn't say that out loud, did I? Turn off the tape. Better than ours is, and I think you really have a chance of implementing it successfully. And I think it would buy you, it would help your faculty members working with students, and I think it would be well worth the investment. Okay. In terms of the website, your website really could be used more effectively to support in communication and enhance self-service. Building a website is not just a technical thing where somebody writes some XML or HTML or whatever they call it to put it together. It's really designing something that communicates something out to the world. And so there really should be wide participation in the design. Update the look and feel. Right now you're using the fairly old design where you have what are called frames, where part of the screen is fixed and the rest of it scrolls. That's a fairly outdated look. You can incorporate, a lot of institutions will incorporate a static menu that allows you to navigate to the major areas. That little menu bar stays on every page throughout the website. Add an enrollment service area and use that as your jumping off point. It can be called students, or you can surf around and really look at how people solve this problem. Would be nice, and we don't know whether we're going to be able to figure out how to do this, is to require that the students go through the website to get to Nelson Online. So perhaps, incidentally, they will learn something else about what's going on their way to do their registration or check their grades or do drop ad. And really reconsider what you're putting on the top page and really decide what's the most important thing to be putting out front versus what you could put a little farther in. And please add a search capability. Recommendations, these are just some brief recommendations about integrating enrollment services with the academic enterprise. That is why we're here, folks, for people to get an education, and there's been a lot of discussion about that side. That's really not what we were focusing on. We think it's important, though, to have some coursework that helps orient students to their life in college, and so we think it would be a good idea for all new degree-placed students to be taking the SED 100 course to get an orientation. And it may take some re-engineering of that course and really looking at helping students get off on the right foot, because going to college is pretty complicated, especially for students who've recently graduated from high school. Second is to continue and expand the involvement of faculty in advising and direction of students, and consider the reward structure for faculty members and how that might be enhanced or tweaked to really get them more involved with direct contact with students.
And this is it. Those were our recommendations, and so what we'd like to focus on now are some next steps, some things to move you forward. Because we think change is not only necessary, we really think it's possible and a great opportunity right now, recognizing this turning point that I talked about earlier. First, it's kind of understanding what change management is all about. Change management itself is really about the human processes that are necessary to kind of recognize and promote change within an organization or an institution such as Thomas Nelson. So when we talk about change management, we're really talking about the human aspect of that, how people need to act and behave differently to recognize customer service as a focus point of every position throughout the organization. Project management, then, is really focusing on the individual tasks that move us forward in order to change on the campus. We think it's important that everyone understand that change occurs all across the organization. This is not something that only the president says is going to happen. This is something that every employee at every level must be engaged in and must understand that it's their responsibility to be a part of a customer service orientation and be a part of this change process. It takes both skill. People need to be educated, they need to be trained, they need to have an understanding of what this means for them in their own position. And they also need, in particular areas, managers need to have the authority to implement that, to make sure that it happens within their authority. They need to be empowered in order to bring that about in their own individual offices and with their staff. The readiness for change needs to be, you need to kick it off with a very clear definition of what change is about. And we think at Thomas Nelson, that's about customer service. That's about really reorienting the institution to recognize who your customers are, who your students are, what your market niche is all about, and really dedicating yourself to allowing those students to be successful. This is what we found in all of our interviews. The longer employees know the change is coming without knowing what the change will be, the higher the anxiety. That's what everybody's feeling right now. The minute the president left, everybody knew that change was going to happen. A new administration means a different kind of organization, and that means change. And nobody knows what that means for them, from senior administrators all the way through staff. How is this going to impact me? And no one knows, and no one's going to know until the new president comes. But this allows a great opportunity for Thomas Nelson if you realize that this kind of an enrollment services study can really present you with great opportunities on providing that new individual, that new incoming president, with a really great theme for that administration and showing them that his staff was really behind that. You need to define the changes that people need to make to be successful in the organization. Every employee I talked to said that they were committed to this institution. It was an amazing kind of process that Marty and I went through in meeting with all of the staff here at this college. There's so many people are so dedicated and so committed and want to do good things for this student population. They really like their jobs and they really want to be successful. That's the first big hurdle. You're over it. Now you need to just tell people how to be successful in this organization. But we caution you. Don't confuse support for change with agreement on what has to change. And so even though employees are going to be very supportive, that's great. Change the organization, just don't change my job. That's going to happen. But we need to cultivate that. We need to work with that. And we need to understand and give a lot of communication about what this is going to mean for individuals. Everybody's going to support the change, as long as it doesn't affect them. Recognize that as you move forward. So how do you move forward? You got to begin. Planning to plan is, you might as well just have the kiss of death. Planning to plan, you can plan forever, and you will never get started. So what you have to do is just get started. You're not going to know all the definitions. Everything is not going to be determined up front. It's not possible to do that because you're in a state of flux. There's a lot of things that have to settle down. There are a lot of offices who still, staff doesn't understand what their particular responsibilities are because there is this kind of environment of chaos. So we need to get that a little organized first. But you got to get started. And so we suggest that you really do begin by developing a general agreement on the objectives of the project. What are some general themes that we can all agree to, that we can set out there as goals for the institution, that we need to move forward with? And then we start to put a timeline together to do that. Why participation is essential. We think town meetings at campus are one of the best things that a president or a senior administrative leadership team can do for a campus. Full town meetings, a couple times a year, all the staff comes, here's what we did last year, here's what we're focusing on next year. Everybody gets together and there's a communication plan around that so that people feel as though they have an opportunity to hear from leadership where we've been and where we're going. Encourage open debate. There is not going to be agreement on exactly the right way to do things. A lot of people have a lot of good ideas. Debate it. Come up with by pulling, something from Mary, something from John, something from Jane, and you put it together, and you're really going to have a good process. If you don't debate it, then something's going to be left out there as a good idea and not incorporated into the process. So we think debate is a great thing. So now what? First things to do, you have to resolve the staffing issue. Nothing can get done on this campus with the level of staff that exists today. You've got to look at your part-time positions, and you have to look at those positions that are indeed critical in key areas that must be transitioned into full-time positions. There are not enough staff on this campus to accomplish the existing workload. So by going into some process of change management, you're not going to have the ability to change without recognizing that you have to get the other tasks done. You have to implement a phone system. There's too much stress on frontline employees to answer routine kinds of calls. So we think you really need to evaluate that telephone system and incorporate changes into that system. A functional PeopleSoft person needs to be hired in the enrollment management area. As Marty described that position description, that needs to be one of the first things that needs to be done. That individual then will take a lot of that burden off the staff who are trying to figure out the ways to do things in various offices. And what we found is that what one staff knows in one office could easily be adopted in another office as the same kind of mechanism to reach that kind of information. So that individual then will be communicating that. Let me tell you what they're doing in registration to get to that information. It's a speedier process. And while I'm looking at a better process, at least adopt this one in the meantime. That individual is going to be responsible for kind of filling those kinds of gaps. Those are the first things you really think you need to tackle up front in order to advance this notion of change. So then what do we do next? There needs to be a leadership plan and there needs to be a communication plan in order to move change forward. Presidential sponsorship is critical. If any kind of change is going to occur on the campus, it's really up to the president to make that decision. So we would recommend to your incoming president that that occur. And we think that there needs to be created an enrollment services leadership team to really establish the policies and the overall governing process of how this is going to happen. And that needs to be a select group of individuals who are committed and understand what this is about. We think the Enrollment Services Committee that's in existence is an excellent committee and should stay operating as it is with maybe some additional members. That would be the operational committee, the committee that's going to pull the ideas and the plan and the policies from that leadership team and make them happen. They're the ones with the ideas. They're the ones who are going to get staff together to really funnel through and evaluate and come up with the good ideas of how to really operationalize policies and plans. And then senior leadership really needs to meet regularly with this team. And then they need to be the ones to come back and communicate in these kinds of town meetings about what's happening. Here's the progress we're making, and here's what the next steps are. So that leadership is engaged and moving this process forward. The enrollment leadership team, we think, should be chaired by the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Services. We think it needs to have membership of 2 deans. It needs to have the Associate Vice President of Financial Services, the Dean of Student Success, which we would recommend being called the Dean of Student Services, and the Associate Vice President for Workforce Training and Continuing Education. And again, we think this needs to be a policy-level committee, a committee that's really evaluating what's critical out of those recommendations that we've listed that can be accomplished in a short period of time. Those things that are really second, we can push those off for a little bit. But kind of going through and prioritizing those recommendations and developing plans for, yes, this is how we think this needs to happen. This is what Thomas Nelson needs to move forward on quickly, and these are things that can kind of move to a back burner for that period of time. The Enrollment Services Committee would essentially have that same membership, but would also include financial aid, admissions registration, business office cashier, marketing, IT, the webmaster, and the functional individual involved in PeopleSoft, institutional planning and research, somebody from the Waynesburg campus, and possibly faculty and students. So that this is a very broad committee. We think it's also important to have staff on this committee, rotated from division staff to staff members from offices coming in on a rotating basis, because we found those are the individuals on the front line who have the best ideas of what needs to happen. So we need to rotate those people through so that they have an opportunity to voice those good ideas. So what's the second step? We think creating a timeline is critical, and creating benchmarks is extremely important. We would put a one-year timeline out there, starting in September of 2004 and working towards fall of 2005. And the reason I put that timeline out there is because you have to get started, and you have to pick some key initiatives that you can implement to advance this campus and do it in a short enough time frame so that people get on board and they can see things are happening. Things are moving, change is occurring. We're starting to move forward. So we would think a one-year timeline is important. So you're beginning as soon as possible. You're making that key date out there by putting out key objectives. And we think key objectives could be something like developing that recruiting staff, creating that office. What is recruiting going to be like at Thomas Nelson? And who should be involved in it? We're talking about cross-functional teams engaged in advising. We would recommend putting that advising office together, pulling all of those factors into one place, implementing that strategy, getting that advising office, working with faculty and finding out the good ideas of faculty, how to meet and interact with students, what's going to work best, what kind of reward structure should be in place, so on and so forth. And then evaluating the idea of this enrollment services area notion. Is this something that you really want to engage in? How do you go about doing it? How do we evaluate generalists? What kind of position description is necessary to create those kinds of positions? We think it's important that once you put those things out there, we would like to have those things implemented by fall of 2005, then what's our month-to-month strategy to get there? What do we have to accomplish? How do we put these cross-functional teams together? How do we get those good ideas out of staff? Where do we start to move this process forward so that by fall of 2005, we have the ability to implement a new recruitment strategy with a new recruiting staff, advising captured in one office where faculty are interacting with students on a regular basis, and we've created generalists. We have an idea of what an enrollment services center is. For those students who are going to come in fall of 2005, we've got a way in which to move them forward based on these market niches, and we know how those students are going to respond to particular services because we've already evaluated that. We've put the strategy in place, and we've moved them forward. We think it's important to think about those cross-functional teams and to develop these important issues, these how-tos that we talk about. What are the individual things we need to do for each one of these market niches, and how do I register? How do I complete a financial aid form? How do I fill out an admission form? What is domicile? All of these kinds of things, creating those how-tos. And that's something that staff will tell you how to do. They know how to do it. Appropriate measures, we think it's important, as Marty said earlier, that you have benchmarks to see whether you're successful and how you're advancing the notion. We think it's important to have a budget process. If you're going to evaluate financial performance, you need to have a budget process in place to do that. If you're going to assess customer satisfaction, then you need to create annual student surveys to gather the kind of information that's important to each office to evaluate their service to students. That you assess work processes. How are staff capable of managing time and workflow? What are the numbers of customers served? How do I staff up in comparison to the staff member next to me? If I see myself working and moving all of these students through, and yet I know that she's working much slower, what's the problem there? How do I evaluate that? Well, right now there's no way for managers to really have the sense of staff that are really working quickly and effectively with students, against those who maybe are not, and maybe could be much better placed in a different area. There's no way to assess that right now. So we need workflow, we need time management, we need to have an understanding of the number of customers served. We also need to assess employee satisfaction. How are employees growing at Thomas Nelson? How are they doing their jobs? Are they happy? Because the one thing we know is that customer satisfaction flows right back to employee satisfaction. If employees are not satisfied, they are not going to deliver good customer service. So we need to have opportunities for employees to express that. Surveys, workshops, those kinds of things, as well as reward structures in place. We think is an important first step that each office should be asked to map their existing work processes as defined by their existing staff. Many staff members do the same process differently, and there should be one process in place to accomplish a lot of these things that go on. But we think staff need to take the time to really map that out and come up with the best process in place. It allows employees to discover problems within their own offices, it empowers them to create the right solution, and it allows them to have buy-in to that ultimate decision making. We think it's important to create these cross-functional teams, to create these new process solutions. It breaks down these barriers once we ask employees to work together to develop a process flow from one office to the other. It encourages then admissions to know what registration is doing, what financial aid is doing, what the cashier's office is doing. We're creating cross-functional teams so that everybody is engaged in understanding what the entire spectrum of services are that we offer to our students. And then we create reward structures, incentives for employees. We're delivering good service, we're positively reinforcing what other members in their office are doing. You create a reward structure for that. And there are a lot of ways to do that. The Commonwealth of Virginia offers that as one mechanism, but there are also things we used to do at Carolina. It was like, employee of the month kind of thing, and they get a Carolina mug, and everybody would come around and sing a super song, and we'd give them a cake. But it was because they did something great. It doesn't take a lot to feel good about what you're doing as long as someone recognizes you. That needs to take place here. Employees need to train other employees. They know how to do what they're doing, and they're the best ones to encourage that kind of training across campus. This is kind of what we sensed as the process before. It was a little confusing, so we're not exactly sure we got it right, but there wasn't recruitment. We don't sense there's any recruitment really going on. We've got a lot of employees, but there's not a lot of retention. And so you've got a lot of individuals coming in and they're kind of falling out through the gaps. And we think that has a lot to do with the fact that advising is very confusing. So we think a much better process would be to develop these cross-functional teams, team members that are engaged in each facet of the process, and put them together on cross-functional teams that are engaged in this recruitment strategy. So that as you're going out and you're recruiting students, you have individuals who have a very clear understanding of the overarching process of financial aid. Not the detailed scholarship and financial aid, but they know how to tell a student how to get through financial aid. Students who are coming to Thomas Nelson need financial aid. They need some sort of financial intervention. That's been proven. You look at the demographics of your population, and financial aid is an important facet for these students. Tell them about it up front and early. What is it that I need to do in order to afford an education? Because if they're told they really think they're going to complete in 2 years just by looking at your catalog, they're not. And if they think they really can afford that, they can't. And so you need to help them. You need to lay out a process that's going to allow them to understand what it means to come into Thomas Nelson, what that program of study is really going to look like, and how can I afford it throughout my college experience so that I can be successful. That's the whole objective here. That's what enrollment service is all about. Thank you for your time. We would like to entertain any questions or any comments that you have about our presentation or our recommendations or suggestions that you have that maybe we didn't get something quite right. But we're open. Comments? Yes, sir.
I'm intrigued by your comment about the telephone system. 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, telephone trees were integrated into the telephone system. So my question is, why aren't they using it?
Well, I am not sure that various offices know that that actual phone system is available and fully implemented on campus.
primary office that you were doing the support one was the one that requested it.
I'm sorry?
The now enrollment management office is the one that requested it. Is that correct, Chris?
We've done several scripts before Sally and I left, and we kept sending scripts and sending scripts, but nothing ever came back, so.
I think what we need to do is rather than analyze the past and how we got here, let's just kind of set that down and decide what plan of action from today would be the best way to get this implemented. Because you can spend most of your energy taken up with Shot John. It's time to get this thing rolling.
And it's clear that the system that's available has a lot of functionality to it. Tom left, but Tom Morehouse was telling us that there's a lot of functionality in this system, that there in fact may even be kind of a script to how to do different things in different offices. But I also think, not just in looking at the phone system, but we actually need to look at some handsets in offices, because many handsets don't have multiple lines, within offices, and so that really holds staff back from having the ability to have multiple lines. So there's a lot of issues, not just with the system itself, but with the handsets and the way in which it's implemented in offices. So someone needs to kind of take that on as their initiative and really see that the functionality is fully implemented, that it's the right way of doing something, and again, begin. The issue isn't to fight about what's the ultimate end product, but it's really just to get started and to find out what is the functionality, how many handsets do we have, what's necessary in each office. Just send out a survey. What isn't working? And then gather that information and find out what functionality exists in the current system that can be adapted or adopted.
And call
within
some
each
places
one of
up.
those. Yeah.
And listen to their menus.
Yeah, right.
Got to navigate, because
Yeah.
the menu gets too deep, you lose your customer.
Right. But there are a lot of layers, I understand, in the system with its functionality as well. So we just need to step back and kind of evaluate that. Yes, ma'am.
On the last slide that you showed us, when you were introducing the next step of change and managing change, I was wondering why counseling was left off or was not incorporated in that last slide, or
Counseling would go under what we're currently calling advising.
okay.
Yes. So that's a new organization. We would stick counseling, which we're calling like psychological counseling, advising, testing, all of those kinds of facets
Really
right
falls
now
in that hall.
that goes under that umbrella. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Kate, my concern. How do we integrate this effort, which needs to be done, with the PeopleSoft version 8 transition, which also needs to be done? Got competition for the same resources.
They are. And I think there's a lot of, there can be a lot of overlap. I think that a lot of information that comes out of one committee can support the other. It's not as though the implementation of PeopleSoft couldn't in fact be a direct, subcommittee or something like that where it looks at functionality within the enrollment services area. It maybe looks at or links with PeopleSoft or something like that, so that we're not, duplicating things. But there clearly needs to be some overlap and some communication structure built in.
And some leadership.
And some leadership, without a doubt, yes. And what's necessary, and what do we want to get out of this new version, and what does this new version going to bring to the table that we're lacking now, but what are those things that the new version is not going to address, that we need to go ahead and start to develop some work around, some shortcuts for being able to do that. Other comments? Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation. You told us that some things I think we already do. But I would like to make a comment on the web page, because those are some steps that have already been made.
Yes, right.
So we do have a web content specialist, and we're updating these changes. He's sent out questionnaires, getting feedback, and there will be a search function.
Great.
So we are progressing in that manner. So hopefully that'll be ready by.
Is there a process for planning, of getting a diverse input on the look and feel and the navigation?
I would say yes. I'm looking to my leader up there. As far, it's being developed, so we have had basically all faculty and staff administrators have been asked their input on the look and feel of it as well. And I'm guessing here that when it's ready to be enrolled, there'll be, some input as far as the final look at. That, it's separate, but it's still being looked at. But it'll be a structure.
Okay, good. Yes, ma'am.
Normally, counselors do a lot of the advising in almost colleges. And I haven't heard you say that. I noticed you kept saying faculty advising, and like you said, psychological counseling. And I'm talking about plain counseling that you're trained to do.
Most of the time, at least in our experience, the advising, that there's a distinction between what a counselor does and what an advisor does. And it's very entrenched. Counselor as advisor is very entrenched into the culture here. But that is not typical. That is not a typical configuration. Usually counselors are doing personal counseling.
You're advising also.
Well,
We would recommend not using the terminology of counselor, but as advisor. And while we recognize that there would be a professional staff of advising, that there would also be greater interaction of the faculty in the advising process. And what we're recommending is a standard terminology at Thomas Nelson that's used in other colleges and universities, where the term counselor not be used as an advising term, but be used only when we refer to counseling in terms of psychological counseling. That's the way it's used traditionally.
So you're
in
saying
higher
that the
education.
faculty is going to take over this role of advising?
We're saying that there may be, at Thomas Nelson, professional staff advising who are trained in advising, but that faculty clearly have to have a much greater role in the advising process. Yes.
The counselors here bring in the new students and put them in a program, but the faculty advisor follows up with them. So, but the counselor is just the first person they see and just put them in that program. And tell them the plan, but then they're there for that psychological or whatever other programs counseling they need. But they don't follow them through to the end of graduation.
No, they don't. The faculty does.
Yeah,
But what I'm saying is, I didn't hear them say that the counselor is the first person to interact with these students. And that bothers me a bit, because I feel that they are trained to do exactly that.
Well, again, we think there needs to be a distinction between counseling and advising, and that this college needs to create an advising structure, traditional in higher education, which requires much greater faculty knowledge. Sir?
Just a comment. You're reflecting a four-year college and university model, not a community college model. You go to any community college, you will find counselors working in the recruiting, intake, and advising process, plus doing mental health, plus doing career counseling, plus doing just about everything else that is involved. Thomas Nelson, at least historically, has been no different than the other 23 community colleges in Virginia and the other 40 or 50 states. At ODU, at William & Mary, at UVA, you have a psychological counseling center, guaranteed, because it's staffed with clinical people. But you don't have counselors. You have psychologists, and it's a professional differential. And the counselors that have been here are trained as educational counselors, career counselors, not therapeutic or clinical psychologists. That's a distinction.
Well, I would argue that in our evaluation of peers, that there is a great move towards developing what we're talking about in terms of an advising structure.
Sure,
And eliminate, and particularly at community colleges. And the reason for that is because of the demographic change that's really occurring all across the nation, where community colleges are becoming increasingly a direct link into four-year colleges and universities, so that there's a traditional terminology that really needs to be implemented at this level. And so the move really is, within community college structures, to really duplicate and replicate the terminology and the structure that exists at four-year colleges. and
Don't
universities.
misunderstand me. I'm all in favor of the advising process and using faculty for that. It's just the other element that is there.
I think as probably the lone faculty person here, I should say something, which is I really believe that we do need to take a more effective and efficient role than we have in the last few years. So I was kind of curious as to why Enrollment Services Committee said that possibly faculty and students should be involved. I think you have to have faculty and students involved at that level.
And I believe there is now. There is faculty involved. The only thing I'm not sure about is, are there students? No students.
But I think that's a great idea
Yeah.
as well. You need the student perspective on all of this throughout.
Thank you. Yes.
Early in the process, you emphasized very heavily the need to increase staff to address the staffing issues. But in the last few slides, I didn't see in the first steps and the second steps that integrated into the things the college really has to address. And
Well, I
we
think that
need
it
to
needs
keep
to.
that on the
I'm
table.
sorry. As we indicated in our last slide, we think there needs to be a conversion from part-time to full-time for a lot of the front office staff. The one thing that we would caution the college at now is to go out and recruit staff for particular kinds of functions today in terms of full-time staff, because we believe that if you put a target out there for fall of 2005, you may be looking at a very different kind of staffing requirement in a year from now than you're going to require today. If you're going to go out and you're going to do a targeted recruitment strategy, you're going to look at really cultivating recruiters. You're going to be looking at really developing a different kind of staffing requirement a year from now than you necessarily would today. And we also think that a couple years down the road, once you're recruiting those students, you've got a targeted market niche, you're bringing them in and you're moving them through a population, you're educating them in STD 100 on what their responsibilities are, that as they move through that process, they'll become increasingly self-sufficient. So over time, your staffing dynamics are going to change. So while we think you need more staff, the first thing we think is that you need to convert a lot of your part-time to full-time in order to really accomplish the workflow that's there. But during that year, as you're really setting up those goals and evaluating your benchmarks along the way, you're really trying to evaluate where that staffing needs to come into play. Because I think you're going to have much different needs in a year from now. If you begin to implement some of these recommendations, then you really have to.
Also, if you're talking staffing, it has to be more full-time faculty.
Without a doubt.
absolutely.
We're playing an increasing role in advising, and we have to have more people to do that.
Well, it was really surprising to us when we started to evaluate the full-time numbers and how they declined so dramatically over time. That's a serious issue that we have to address, and absolutely, that's what you're all about. Any other comment? Thank you very much.
I just, on behalf of the college, want to thank you for the time and energy you put into this project. I couldn't help but think that sitting here, gee, I'm overdue for a colonoscopy. And you really have looked at all of our weak points and all of our hidden flaws. You have examined us probably better than the Mayo Clinic examined us. Should I go in for overhaul there? But just as in all cases, the way you get better and you get healthy as a patient, you have to be a participant in the process. You have given us ideas, you have given us exercise plans, you have given us healthy eating habits that you've suggested to us. We have to decide what we are going to do and how we are going to do it and how we are going to step forward and make a difference for this institution and for our students. So we thank you for getting us started, for putting it squarely in front of our faces so that we can't avoid it, and ensuring that we are going to have to deal with answering some tough questions about who we are and where we are going to go in the future. So on behalf of the college, I want to thank you for taking that time and for showing us who we are and how we need to move forward, and giving us some talking areas in terms of how we are pulling together to make a difference for the peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you.